Welcome. I'm Lawrence Cherney, founding artistic director of Soundstreams. Thank you for joining us for Inside Look. This event is part of the Soundstreams Insider program, our brand new membership opportunity, and it's free to join. Stay tuned for upcoming events. Thanks to those of you who have already joined this growing group of insiders, and we hope those new to us will join online at soundstreams.ca. Soundstreams has a long history of exploring themes that resonate with the broader community. There were two pivotal events in the 19th and 20th century that changed forever the relationships between French and English. One was the Riel Rebellion and the execution of Louis Riel. The other, the October Crisis of 1970. The October Crisis, which took place 50 years ago this month, continues to have resonance for us in Canada and elsewhere in the world. We decided to commission an opera to reflect upon those events. The librettist is Nicola Bion and the composer André Ristic. A complete first draft of the libretto and music is now finished, and we plan to premiere it in 2023. In this program, we'll interview a series of guests, beginning with an overview of the October Crisis. It gives me great pleasure to introduce documentary filmmaker Terence McKenna, who is no stranger to most, if not all, Canadians. Terence has been a journalist for CBC, radio and television for 40 years. He has produced numerous documentaries on subjects both domestic and international, and if I listed all the awards that he's won, I think it might take longer to do that than to do the actual interview. But it's so wonderful to have you with us today to speak more about the October Crisis, which of course is having its 50th anniversary this very month. And I wonder, for people who may not be so familiar with those events, I wonder if you could take us back and talk a bit about the Front de Libération du Québec that started in '63. What were their aims, who belonged, and what were their goals, and in what ways did that lead to the October Crisis 7 years later?
You know, my impression is that the FLQ was a very loose coalition of a bunch of people who kind of adopted that name. They didn't necessarily even know each other. The early people concentrated on, putting some bombs in mailboxes, that kind of thing, especially in the English suburb of Westmount, and working up to eventually a major explosion at the Montreal Stock Exchange that injured 27 people. And but it was people who didn't know each other. There was also guys, there were some people killed in some of these bombings, and some of their other operations. A bunch of guys decided on a deciding a very quick turnaround to go and steal a bunch of guns from a gun store in Montreal, and thinking that people would just pass over the guns inside. The owner of the store resisted, and one of the guy who was supposed to be the getaway driver or something shot him, which surprised everybody else in the operation. They thought they would just take the guns and run. And so he eventually, went to jail for murder. And so it was a loose coalition of people with different ideas. A lot of them were very taken with the international revolutionary movements at the time, particularly the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The Tupamaro guerrillas in Uruguay was a major thing. And I think people didn't take all that very seriously. There was they thought it was a small collection of nutty guys until the October Crisis happened. The Tupamaro guerrillas, for example, kidnapped a British ambassador in Uruguay, and the British government kind of quietly, through intermediaries, paid about, I think, $40,000 to ransom the British ambassador. And so they thought, well, we'll grab the British Trade Council in Montreal, James Cross, and they thought, it'd be a short amount of time until the government would accede to their demands and pay the ransom. I think, Pierre Trudeau had a very firm idea about not negotiating with terrorists, and that was his kind of reaction to it at the start. you know, I spent a long time talking about this and other things with Pierre Trudeau, and he said, you know, you journalists always think everything the government does is a master plan that is executed piece by piece, and there's always ulterior motives and things and whatnot. And, you know, mostly what the government of Canada does, in my experience, is chaos, is managing chaos. And so he set out this idea that we should not negotiate with terrorists, and he thought everybody understood that. He put his external affairs minister, Mitchell Sharp, in charge of managing the crisis because it was a diplomat who was kidnapped. And the first thing Mitchell Sharp did was allow the FLQ manifesto to be read out on the air on the Radio Canada. And Pierre Trudeau went, "What are you doing? This is giving into the terrorist first demand. What are you doing?" He says, no, I'm not giving into the terrorist demands. They have other demands. This was something very small, and Trudeau was quite upset with him. So there was a lot of chaos on all sides. There was chaos in the Montreal police. There was chaos in the Quebec government. And but still, until in the early stages, until Pierre Laporte was kidnapped, people thought this was nothing very serious. When Pierre Laporte was kidnapped, it took on a totally new dimension, and people thought, wow, this is a much bigger and well-organized organization than they had anticipated.
There was a rally at the Sauvé Arena in Montreal and this is of course before Pierre Laporte was found dead, but there were some 3,000 people at that particular rally. How widespread was the support for the FLQ, or do we know?
You know, I don't think we know. I think, you know, people have pointed out, many young people in that era had posters of Che Guevara on their wall and sympathized with the Cuban Revolution, and so it's natural that there would be support for this kind of thing. You know, the first line of the communique said, "We are not modern day Robin Hoods." I think that's in fact exactly how a lot of young Quebecers saw them, as modern day Robin Hoods who were sticking it to the bosses and you know, had the courage of their convictions, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason we don't really know is that I think it was the day after that rally took place, the War Measures Act was brought in, and many people were arrested. And very quickly after that, Pierre Laporte was executed, and that just totally destroyed sympathy for the FLQ in Quebec at the time. It just went, I think, went close to zero. And, you know, as unpopular as the War Measures Act is now, at the time, the War Measures Act was very popular in Quebec. But in the kind of extreme hysteria of the time and the drama of the situation, you know, Pierre Trudeau, for example, I didn't know this until I interviewed him many years later, was Pierre Laporte's seatmate at Collège Brébeuf. They had sat side by side in Collège Brébeuf. And so he knew him very well. René Lévesque was the leader of the PQ, who was just starting the PQ in those years, had just had their first election. Knew Pierre Laporte very well. They had been in the équipe de tonnerre, the team of thunder of Jean Lesage in the Liberal government in Quebec in the early 1960s, which was, you know, this was the quiet revolution, and so René Lévesque was really shocked and horrified by what these guys were doing. And that remained a bone of contention between Lévesque and other members of the PQ who were more sympathetic to the FLQ. René Lévesque took a very hard line against them, but at the same time was kind of pleading with the government to, hey, whatever you're going to do, don't let these two guys get killed. You know, you should negotiate. You should negotiate. You should let people out of prison and this kind of stuff. And so he was very torn. But if you look at the interview with René Lévesque on the night that Pierre Laporte died, he was just shattered by this. He was shattered. And years later, Margaret Trudeau wrote a memoir saying that when, you know, the phone rang in the middle of the night, they told Pierre Trudeau that Pierre Laporte was dead, and that he broke down and sobbed all night. So he was very, they were very shattered by it, both of them.
We'll be speaking with André Ristic, the composer, and the librettist Nicolas Bion. They were less interested, of course, in creating an historical pageant, in the sense that there are many things that one can watch and see that reveal some of the details of this series of events. What they were interested in exploring was universal themes, among which could be included the idealism of youth to change the world, and sometimes with tragic consequences in this case. Also, the huge question of is violence ever justified as a means of achieving a greater good? Were those what the October Crisis was about? And or are there other themes as well that were found there?
No, I think that's a very important part of it. And René Lévesque, I remember him saying that, if that this he kind of speaking to young people and speaking to the kind of people who would support the FLQ, and said, as noble as you think your dreams are, this is not the way to go about it. And if you proceed down this road, what you will do is murder your dreams. You will make it impossible to bring these dreams about.
Our next guest is writer Nicola Bion. Nicola has written for theater, for film, for television, Elephant Song, Butcher, a play, a film, have won awards across Canada and been seen internationally. It's really a pleasure to speak with you about this big project. I do remember calling you, this must be 7 or 8 years ago, and hitting you with this huge idea in a first phone call, which I'm guessing you remember also. What was your visceral reaction to the idea of doing a big work on a big subject?
Yeah, it was God. That phone call was a while ago, I think, and I think it was an interesting time too, because at that point I hadn't really done anything. I hadn't done anything of that scale, on the scale of what kind of Laporte wanted to do, and so I was very interested in that idea of like scale, but I think particularly emotional scale. I think that seems to be the thing that opera is really good at, and it was kind of an interesting idea to see how to use that with a story like the kidnapping of Pierre Laporte.
At the time of that phone call, you mentioned that even though you weren't born, of course, until after the October Crisis, you and your family has a connection actually to that, quite a direct connection to that period.
Indeed, my dad worked for Gérard Pelletier, who was one of who at the time I believe was Minister of State in Trudeau's cabinet, and so really had a direct relationship to the events of 1970.
Not perhaps in the first phone call, but it didn't take very many discussions for you to pass on a couple of ideas. First of all, about things you weren't going to do. One of them being you had no interest, nor did we actually, in the creation of an historical pageant. The history, in a sense, is there for people to discover. But you also were not interested in assigning blame in what is, of course, a very controversial series of events. When you were looking for a skeleton, a way to frame this opera, what kinds of conventions did you consider, and what did you end up using?
I really wanted to bring this back to the sort of the more, the human cost of the October Crisis, and I think that's where the initial idea of potentially having Laporte's ghost come in, and from there I was looking for a kind of a structure, a skeleton, some kind of scaffolding on which to sort of build the opera. And that's when I came across the idea of using the 5 stages of grief, based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model. And that was sort of the key moment in terms of sort of the, you know, the lightning in a bottle for how I saw the opera sort of going. And so I use that and this idea of like seeing the play through the eyes of Laporte, of the victim, and through his ghost.
And of course, you also reversed the convention of starting with an earlier event, moving to a later event. Of course, historically, you know, Laporte was kidnapped and a week later was found murdered. And you reversed this in your, again, it's an opera, of course, in many ways you can do what you want, but dramatically, what function did it solve a problem by doing it that way?
In a sense it did, because I think what we were talking about earlier about how we didn't want this to be any kind of a history lesson. I think, you know, most people who will go see the opera, who have some knowledge of the October Crisis, know that Laporte died. So this is not a surprise. There's no reason to sort of make that the crescendo of the opera. I mean, you know, the best example I can think of is like the story of the Titanic. We all know the Titanic sunk. So, you know, keeping that to the end as some kind of surprise or reveal doesn't really work. And so for me, it was sort of the same thing with Laporte. And by doing things sort of backwards in time, what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to have Laporte's ghost experience all the things that happened leading up to his death, but this time with the knowledge that these things would lead to his death. You know, and you know, I stole in some ways there from both things like Christmas Carol or Our Town, where, you know, there are similar similar structural similarities to what I'm doing with Laporte.
As you point out, the October Crisis was full of larger than life figures: Pierre Trudeau, Paul Rose, Pierre Laporte, Francis Simard, Robert Bourassa, many others. And your goal, if I understand it, was to bring them to life as flesh and blood human beings with all their strengths and frailties. As a playwright, what challenges does this present to take figures in a sense we think we all know, but in fact, we don't know them as human beings at all?
Yeah, and I think, you know, the challenge there is that there's a real balance between the dramatic needs of the opera and the truth and the veracity of who they were as historical figures. And ultimately, you know, it's a balance between those two things. And so, you know, I created a Laporte that, you know, may or may not be very close to who Laporte actually was. Same things for all the other characters that we named. But ultimately, the hope is to elicit both an emotional response from the audience, from the story and the music and what's happening, but also, you know, hopefully, if we're very lucky and everything sort of falls into place, a way to reflect on, you know, our common humanity, which is a theme that I go back to over and over and over again in all my works. You know, again, if we're lucky, that may be one of the results of of watching the opera.
Thank you, Nicola, for joining us. and for offering those insights into your new opera, Laporte.
All right, thanks so much.
Bye. It gives me great pleasure to welcome composer André Ristic, who's speaking to us from Brussels. Welcome. You've written works in virtually every genre. You have written many works for Soundstreams going back almost 25 years. In fact, these have all been instrumental pieces for all kinds of combinations, piano and string quartet, for 3 brass quintets, chamber orchestra, 6 pianos. The most recent piece you've written for us, apart from the opera Laporte, is for 6 pianos, and it's called Vivaldi Variations. Could you say a few words about it?
Yes, that's the 6 piano piece you referred to earlier. And it's an important piece for me because every 10 years, my way of feeling music as a composer has changed, depending on basically the evolution of my personal life. And the Vivaldi Variations represent the very latest turning point in my life. And that was what, 3 years ago, something like that, in 17, 18, something like that.
Let's listen to a brief excerpt from André Ristic's Vivaldi Variations. You've also written music for theater and opera, including Les Aventures de Madame Merveille, which was essentially an animated opera based on a comic book. Almost all the pieces you've written for us have had a lighter side. You have a lovably impish sense of humor, but clearly Laporte has a totally different resonance from those previous works. What attracted you to this particular subject?
Well, it's maybe less than the subject is the way that the subject is presented. So it's a moment in history. It's something that has been widely documented by journalists, maybe the most. And the interest here is the treatment that we can give it through music, right? So using singing voices to tell this story. That's very interesting. I mean, I think because it's something that happened for real, that you can't really mess around a lot because it's not far away in the past, like some kind of mythologic event or something that we use a lot of the time. And so you got limitations, but at the same time, the challenge was very, very attracting to me to have real people like Trudeau or Laporte himself sing and do things on stage, putting a human face on historical figures.
There are things one can do in an opera that we never see in our normal lives. For example, a prime minister, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, singing. What challenges are posed when writing music for legendary historical figures?
Yes, I sort of tried to imagine like I've never seen Trudeau on television or something like that. I tried to put him in a way back in the past, sort of like Napoleon, or I don't know, some other character from the history, but far enough that you detach yourself. Now, that wasn't exactly easy, and I ended up, using a little bit of his, in the case of Trudeau, of his voice is very characteristic. He has a very rather high-pitched voice for a politician. So this did influence me clearly, but I tried to ignore, in fact, the fact that they were known figures, that I lived with them when I was with them on television. I mean, when I was a youngster. And yeah.
The librettist Nicola Bion has structured Laporte in 5 acts, each representing one of the 5 stages of grief. You've written music in 5 different styles matching each of those 5 stages. Operas are often through composed, so was it a challenge to create unity in this work with a structure like this?
When I start composing an opera, it's a big project. It's a long moment in music. It's rather long. It's usually more than an hour. In my case, always longer than an hour. And so I like to have these restrictions a little bit to order my thinking, to have like these 5 very precise emotions. Immediately when we started, I was attracted by that, and I started doing. It's like five pieces for me, really. So each of them is self-contained in a way in terms of emotion. You won't. When we're talking about anger, you don't really get out of anger at any point. I'm talking about Act 3, I think, if my memory is good, and you stay in this mood for the whole 10, 15, 20 minutes it's going to last. And so it was a very structuring, it's a perfect structure for me. I like to be economical in the music I use. That's a fancy way of saying I'm leaning towards repetitive minimalism, but the economic aspect of it is what interests me in this kind of language. And Nicola really did I can't tell you how much. It's a complex work of writing, because he did put everything in a certain, he had to organize himself also in these 5 compartments, let's say, that depict the events. Roughly the last week of his life, because 5 stages, it's not 7 days, but almost. And it's really well organized chronologically. You can really follow the idea, and puts a lot of what I like the most about his writing is a lot of humanity in characters that we read about in newspapers or see in documentaries. Now they're real humans with feelings, with emotions, and sometimes very touching too, I think.
Now we'll listen to an excerpt from the overture realized on MIDI. This excerpt foretells very dramatically the murder of Pierre Laporte. Could you tell us briefly what to listen for?
Well, it's quite, how do I put it? It's quite direct. If you listen to it at first, you'll think, well, that's fine. It's contemporary music, but it's really a heart stopping, quitting is a normal beating function. And so it's pretty descriptive, I think, if you have this clue. If you don't have it, I don't know. But the fact that the way he died was a little bit, for a long time, totally unknown, because everybody was telling different stories. In any case, we're not exactly certain how he died, and that's what I try to depict by having this rather long agony. So maybe in the real events, it happened quite fast. I don't know, but here it lasts quite a little while, and I think to me, it was a way to exaggerate how dramatic every death is dramatic, of course, but this one has had so many repercussions and a long-term effect. I mean, we still talk about it these days, 50 years later. It's something I had to try to exaggerate, I think, in terms of not only depicting somebody, well, you know, like Prokofiev would do in the Romeo and Juliet, which is perhaps something similar. Is there a fight? Is there not a fight? It's very ambiguous, and yeah, I tried to make it as dramatic as possible. In fact, I couldn't find something. I was going to say worse, but more violent way of depicting it musically. I think it's gives me the creeps.
Again, thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. Now we'll listen to an excerpt from the first act of the opera Laporte. Our guests have spoken eloquently about the October Crisis of 1970 and in what ways it inspired an opera. The themes of the October Crisis still resonate for us. Terence McKenna, could you reflect on the ways in which those themes are being played out again in the world of today?
You know, I certainly would not draw, for example, a parallel to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is very much a pacifist approach to politics. They were much more in relation to the Black Panthers. I think they identified with the Black Panthers. Pierre Valliere wrote a famous book, you know, comparing the plight of oppressed Quebecers to the Black oppression in the United States. They saw it very much on that line. Shockingly, what we see in the news in recent days is that right-wing groups, particularly in Michigan, have obviously decided that in the circumstance that they're facing, that perhaps kidnapping the governor of Michigan would be merited. And these are guys who, you know, wave their guns around and walk into the, you know, stretching the right to carry weapons to its absolute nth degree. And clearly, we're laying, according to the FBI, we're, you know, making plans to kidnap the governor of Michigan and the governor of Virginia, and to, you know, once again, violence justified in the situation. And who knows if Donald Trump loses the election, for example, whether these people will say, oh, well, then, you know, we have to move to the next stage. And so you're seeing, you know, the same kind of fanatical devotion to a cause that can lead to violence that is not something that's the exclusive domain of left-wing groups.
It's a great note on which to end. I've been joined by television journalist and documentary filmmaker Terence McKenna. Thank you so much for bringing us insights into the October Crisis and what its implications may be for the wider world. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you all for joining us tonight for Inside Look. We've taken an inside look at the newly commissioned opera Laporte. We've heard from 3 people tonight we'd like to thank for appearing with us: Terence McKenna, CBC journalist and filmmaker; Nicola Bion, writer who did the libretto for Laporte; and the composer André Ristic. In the coming 3 years before the premiere in 2023, please stay in touch with us and watch our website for further details as the production is developed and comes to fruition. Again, thank you and good night.